My name is Becky Megas, she, her pronouns, and I am the founder and chief care connector for Women in Sustainability. Women in Sustainability is an inclusive social and environmental justice nonprofit dedicated to caring for the people that care for the planet through community advocacy, resources, and education to create a sustainable and equitable future through the feminist viewpoint and leadership. Women in Sustainability strives to create a safe space for like-minded and diverse individuals to create purposeful connections and conversations like we're having today. And all are welcome in our community. Now we're going to go ahead and introduce today's speaker, Kelsey Atos. Kelsey is a copywriter who helps sustainable brands tell their stories better. Working with her means creating copy that stays top of mind with your consumers and that stands out from the crowd. She has experience with white papers, web copy, emails, blog posts, product descriptions, reports, case studies, and more. She prefers bigger projects where she can create an impact together, but will occasionally take a one-off project as well. As a creative writer and a previous community manager, Kelsey knows that in order to create better copy, we need to know your audience inside and out. Before you work together, she likes to gather a deeper understanding of your audience and brand. From there, you'll strategically create storylines that are accessible to your audience. Storylines create powerful, memorable narratives necessary for your brand's success. She works with sustainable brands because your stories are the ones that need to be told now to save our planet. So let's work together to expand and accelerate your impact. So please help me give a warm Women in Sustainability welcome to Kelsey.
Hi, everybody. First things first, I just want to take a second to say thank you so much for being here. Time is our most precious resource. And the fact that there are 16 of you, 12, 16, somewhere in there, people keep popping in and out. I'm just like blown away, and I'm so excited to get to connect and talk with you about how we tell better stories, essentially. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right. Can everybody see that? Yes? Okay, fantastic. And we're just seeing the presentation. We're not seeing all my slide notes, right? Yes? Okay, perfect. I like to double check. So as Becky said, hi everyone, I'm Kelsey, and thank you so much for joining me today. And thank you so much for that amazing introduction, Becky. I really appreciate it. Today, we're going to talk about how we can make sustainable writing more accessible. Now, by that, I just want to clarify, I'm not talking about making it more accessible through the lens of like the American Disability Act, which is super important as well, but not my expertise. Rather, I'm going to be talking about how to make sustainable writing more accessible just to the general public, which a lot of folks write a lot of sustainability writing that really isn't very accessible. So we have a lot of opportunities to create better stories here. And before I really even talk about myself, I want to ask you all a question. Maybe. Yes. Okay. So let's share in the chat. Where did your sustainability journey start? And when I say, when did your sustainability journey start? What I mean more than that is, on a granular level, what was the story behind why you decided to care? Because the answer here is likely not, I got tired of seeing ocean in the trash in the ocean. Why were you in the ocean? What did you find in the ocean? Why was it so frustrating to you? And what do you feel changed in that moment for you that day? And while you guys do that, I'm going to attempt to figure out if I can get the chat back so I can read some of the responses. Carolyn says she saw her community destroyed. I'm just going to give us a couple minutes to let them trickle in. Amy says, working as an intern with Water for People, I learned about the serious state of our water infrastructure in the US and the true lack of water resources internationally. Yeah, absolutely, Amy. My good friend Kate worked at Water for People for a really long time. Kate's the Tina Sawyer. It's an amazing organization. It's super awesome to hear that you work with them. Defining purpose statements for brands and realizing that's not enough. Getting continually frustrated that orgs can hide behind false commitments without the strategies or actions to back them up. Tara and I could talk about this forever. Greenwashing is such a frustrating thing, especially when there are so many companies and organizations that really want to do the right thing. Kelsey says, I became interested in the food system and the impacts of animal agriculture. Yeah, and there's a lot to learn there. Emily says, when I was in high school, my friend and I wrote, directed, and starred in our own theater production, playing exaggerated versions of ourselves. The character my friends wrote of me was deeply concerned with things like pollution, recycling, etc. And I realized being more like that was being more myself. Wow, Emily, that's a beautiful story. Thank you so much for sharing that. I'm going to give it just a little bit more to see if anyone else is finishing up a story. Okay, great. If you want to share your sustainability story later, feel free to keep popping it in. I love stories. I've always loved stories, and that's pretty integral to who I am. So let's go ahead and get into that. Let me tell you a little bit of my story. My name's Kelsey, and I grew up in a house that thought an inconvenient truth was propaganda. And we recycled, but it was only because aluminum could get you some extra cash in the town we lived in. And I hated, capital H, hated my science classes. I have multiple memories of crying in chemistry, being like, I absolutely despise this class. Instead, I gravitated towards English. And this is the part of my career my parents actually always nourished and believed in. They were never afraid of me becoming the starving artist. And often when I tried to pick more lucrative careers in other directions, like nursing or something like that, they would tell me, I don't know why you're trying to be anything else when you're a writer, Kelsey. Becky and I talk a lot about our upbringing and how we ended up in sustainability. And for me, there was really one story that really stood out. Today, I'm a copywriter for sustainable brands, as Becky mentioned, and I'm dedicating my life to the most important people on the planet, the people who are trying to save it. But how did I get here? There's a couple of impactful stories, but one that really stands out to me, and it's a story about a whale. I'm going to compare it to another story that I feel has some similarities and some differences. So this is a tale of two stories, one about an orca whale and one about an ivory-billed woodpecker. Taliqua is a whale that lives off the coast of Washington. Her species has been on the endangered species list for 13 years. And in 2018, she gave birth to a calf that only lived for about 30 minutes before it died. Now, when orcas die, they sink to the bottom of the ocean. But Taliqua wasn't ready to let go yet. And so she pushed her calf to the surface of the ocean for 17 days and swam over 1,000 miles with the help of her pod. The scientists who watched her and later the world coined this pushing up of her calf over and over and over again for days and miles on end as the tour of grief. Her story was so moving that a dam was taken down to help increase her food supply. And in 2020, Taliqua had another calf who's still a part of their pod today. Okay, now let's go ahead and talk about another story, and that's of the ivory-billed woodpecker. Okay, so I'm curious, does anybody know this story? We've got a couple of heads shaking no. Okay, great. I'm not surprised because there's really not much of a story. They went extinct in 2021. When they were added to the extinct list, biologist John Fitzpatrick said, a bird this iconic and this representative of the old major growth forests of the Southeast, keeping it on the list of endangered species keeps attention on it, keeps states thinking about managing the habitat on and off and the chance that it still exists. So now, the similarities of these stories are super clear. They're both animals. They're both endangered, or one's now extinct due to human activity. They both even kind of look the same from a color perspective. But the difference between these two stories is that one species has a story and the other one doesn't. In Taliqua's case, the story is after a calf died an hour after the mother gave birth, it was pushed to the surface for 17 days, over 1,000 miles before letting it sink to the bottom of the ocean. When it comes to the ivory-billed woodpecker, we don't have that same intimate story to drive us to action. Another animal on the endangered species list just feels overwhelming. We know there are a lot of animals and plants that we're losing every single day due to the mass extinction that we're currently living in. Do you hear the difference in those two stories, even just as I retell them to you? and how one is easier to tell than the other? We can't directly tie the story or lack thereof to the outcome of these two situations, but we can ask ourselves, what if? If Taliko had never had her tour of grief, would the dam have been opened? Would she have had enough food? Would she have had another calf a few years later? And if she did, would it have lived? Because that pod had not had a calf in 5 years. We can't say, and we'll never know, but we also know from our sustainability journey that every little bit can add up. So, okay, now I want to go ahead and move into another question that I have for you all. What does accessibility mean to you? And don't worry, I don't have any precursors in this situation or expectations. Feel free to share what accessibility means to you. And just keep in mind, there are no wrong answers. Alicia, thanks so much for taking the time to share your sustainability story with us. That's amazing that you were able to create that program. Becky says to her, accessibility means for everyone. Haley says, easily digestible information. Amy says, ability to access something, ability to get. Taryn says, relatable. Carolyn says, easy to understand, embrace, and connect to. I like that connection piece, Carolyn. Yasmin says, accessible, relatable, understandable to many. Alicia says, ability to access and understand. Okay, yeah, great. Those are all great answers. And yeah, agree with the others, free of jargon, using language that your audience already speaks. Yeah, that's a great point, Emily. Okay, great. I'm going to talk about the 3 things to keep in mind when making your writing and other folks' writing more accessible to the general public. I think you all nailed what accessibility means. And all of you are right, essentially. Like, accessibility is someone's ability just to understand, take in the information. And from a marketing standpoint and a communication perspective, as a storyteller, it's important to me that they can retell those stories. And I think that's the part that sometimes we miss, is it's not just the comprehension of understanding the story, but understanding the story enough to be able to tell it back to someone else. That's what makes a story really successful. So we have 3 principles we're going to go through, and the first is readability. So please share in the chat what readability means to you. And thank you all for being so participatory in the chat. It just feels a little bit more communal in this like Zoom screen world that we live in. So I really appreciate it. Thank you. Jasmine says plain language. Carolyn says comprehension. Clear, concise, and direct from Jennifer. No jargon from Becky. Sydney says easy to understand and comprehend. Kelsey says people understand and retain what they just read. Yeah, absolutely. So when I think about readability, I think of the quality of the writing to be easy or enjoyable to read. You know the difference between trying to read like a textbook in college versus trying to read like a beach read. One is just much easier to tear through really quickly, whereas the other one just feels heavy and that's hard to get through. And so I kind of think of those 2 things as like a spectrum of like the textbook to a beach read. There are a couple of ways I like to make the writing I do as a copywriter for sustainable brands more readable. The 3 things to keep in mind when you're writing for the masses when it comes to readability is you should write for a 5th grader, that simple stories stick, and to create building block material. Some of you are likely thinking, why a 5th grader? And many of my clients will say, no, our audience reads at a much higher level than that. Part of it is it's not about the level that they can read at, but what level is actually going to be enjoyable for them to read. And beyond that, most people don't know that the average American actually reads at a 5th grade reading level. So if you're going to be writing anything that's going to be facing towards the masses, then it's really important that you write at that level. So that way, everyone who reads it has a better chance of understanding your story or your message. The other point I want to make is that like most folks don't, even if your audience does read at a higher level, most folks don't want to curl up in front of a fire and read a science dissertation. They want to read something that's easier to read. So to write for a fifth grader, use simpler phrases. If there's an easier way to say something that has the same meaning, then you should say it that way. For example, don't say purchase when you could say buy or sale. Those are easy words to swap out to make your writing a little bit more accessible. If you you can also take a look at your sentence length. If you can make a sentence shorter, then you should do it. Long sentences can make text less accessible to those reading at lower levels. And lastly, try not to use passive voice. This is just a good communication principle in general, but it does get easier to understand when you're using active voice to write. And one tool that I want to plug here, if you're like, well, Kelsey, how do I know what reading level I'm writing at? Like, that's great, but how do you know? The Hemingway app online, it's like hemingwayapp.com, is a fantastic tool that will tell you if your sentence lengths are too long or hard to understand, kind of hard to understand, and really hard to understand. And they also include noting where your passive voice is, noting opportunities to use simple words, and it'll tell you what reading level it's written at. Microsoft Word also has the ability to go in and find it. I don't use that because I don't want to pay for Microsoft Word. But if that was your preferred way to write things, then you could definitely find like a YouTube video that would walk you through how to check the reading level of your document in Microsoft Word online. Next, simple stories stick. If your story is too complicated to be retold, then it's not going to stick in your reader's head and it's not going to be retold. Try and make your stories as simple and impactful as possible. There's a good chance you all can retell the whale story that I just told you. But that quote from the biologist would be really hard for you to regurgitate accurately and actually remember what he said because there wasn't a story there, right? Last, you want to create building block materials. Why? Because if someone doesn't understand what you're saying and doesn't have the information readily accessible to them, chances are they're just simply going to move on. They're going to say, this information isn't for me. I can't read it. I don't understand it. And you think about how interested you have to be in something to be trying to read something, come across something you don't understand, Google it, get up to speed on that capacity, and then jump back into your document. Like, you have to be outstandingly committed to learning the information in order to do that, right? So the best thing that brands can do is try and build building block information. So that way, if we know our general audience doesn't really understand this, we can create the information around it so they don't have to go search it and it links through really easily. Also, as someone who works deeply in SEO, those internal links are a really good idea. By creating building block materials, we can make complex subjects more accessible because writing in science disciplines isn't always going to be simple. It's just not. Sometimes things are complicated, but let's build our way up to them. Does anybody have any questions on readability before I hop to the next principle? No? Got some head shakes? Great. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next one, but if you have them, feel free to pop it in and I'm keeping an eye on the chat. Okay, so next we're going to talk about leading with empathy. And I'd love to know, what does empathy mean to each of you? Go ahead and share in the chat. Emily, I see you use the Hemingway app as well. That's great. Looks like Emily says empathy is meeting people where they are. Haley says caring in an understanding way. I feel what you feel. Listening, ability to connect emotionally to a person, situation, or story. Genuine connection and understanding. Ability to understand and connect with another person's emotions and feelings. Yeah, I completely agree. I think those are all really great examples of empathy. So approaching situations with compassion and understanding. Yep, absolutely. And that's a really great one actually to lead into, because that's really when I'm writing what I try to keep in mind. Approaching situations with compassion and understanding. The first thing that I would say is important within this realm is not catastrophizing a situation. Listen, I know at the end of the day, we're kind of screwed right now. I completely recognize that. And it's hard not to catastrophize because it's true. But when we catastrophize, we overwhelm folks. And it's hard to be moved to action when we're overwhelmed. Plus, when you push the worst of the worst, you're up against gun violence, sexual assault, wars, institutionalized racism, and widespread depression and anxiety. We just don't have the mental capacity to care about all of those things. This means that when your doom-filled story hits the web, it gets lost and overlooked because it can feel impossible to solve the problem. The difference between we need to get these whales more food in order to help their pod reproduce, this specific pod, versus save all the whales is a very different story. The second is being kind to your reader. We're all at different phases of our sustainability journey. You're likely compromising on things in different aspects of your life. I think a great example for myself is I'm so fantastic at composting, but sometimes I just need a Ziploc bag and I need to work through how I stop using Ziploc bags. But we all have these things that we compromise on in our sustainability journey. There's really no room for shame in this movement, and we're all doing the best that we can. Sustainability is reusing products. This is an example that I always think of, but sustainability is reusing products, and there are a lot of folks that don't vote in line with many sustainability initiatives, but they do reuse their Cool Whip containers. Instead of fighting them, we should be asking how we bring them into the fold. So I don't think this will be a surprise to anyone, but lead with empathy. Don't create doom and gloom because it's just not helping with us, and don't shame. Okay, and last but not least, inclusivity, which also likely comes as a surprise to no one. I do want to level set this and say there is one thing on the next slide that's likely to upset some of you, but I'm asking you to come in with an open mind and an open heart. But before we get there, what does inclusivity mean to all of you? Amy says open to all. Becky says all. Making all kinds of people feel welcome, all. Yeah, there's a lot of all here, which I like. I like the simplicity of that. That's making inclusivity, making that simpler, right? Our first principle, all. Welcome and safe, genuine opening of the door to everyone. Yeah, absolutely. Those are all great examples. So when I think about making sustainable information inclusive, the first thing I'm going to say, here's your trigger warning. Your grammar policing, for those of you who think that grammar is the utmost importance, is unfortunately, I have to tell you, a racist, classist, outdated, and oppressive practice keeping folks from talking about sustainability. And that's because the point of communication is to share information. And if the information and concept is shared in full, it doesn't matter which use of there someone uses. Second, include diverse voices. We need more people writing within the sustainability movement who don't only speak standard American English. These diverse stories are important because when new diverse groups begin to take action, others do too, because they can see themselves in the movement finally. And last is supporting of code meshing. There's a lot of research that has come out in the last 10 years or so that supports code meshing over code switching. Code meshing allows folks who speak multiple languages or dialects to switch between the two throughout a conversation, rather than switch from one dialect to the next, depending on who or what they're talking about. And the other precursor that I want to make for this, for code meshing and code switching is if this is not your lived experience, please do not imitate it. There are tons of really talented, amazing writers who do have this lived experience that would love to work with you. If you do it inauthentically, it's just going to be a PR disaster and nobody wants to get canceled. So our takeaways, right? If you take nothing else from this presentation, the story that I want you to remember, write for a fifth grader, be empathetic with your writing, be inclusive, and tell great stories that stick. And now I'm available if anybody has any questions. You can do that in the chat, or if you're more comfortable coming off mute and asking a question, that's totally fine too. Just give them the chat a couple minutes to see if any pop through.
Yeah, I'll add Kelsey, and I've had these conversations even for me personally. I've like will have these conversations, especially like the meeting people where they are having empathy. And I've had some issues with a neighbor, and we had some really good conversations around it. So definitely take a moment to ask your questions, because I think that there's so much we can learn in this moment of how do we speak to people, and how do we, I think, take our perspective and sometimes anger, because for me, it was an anger situation, out of it to be able to bring people into these conversations. And I will tell you, Kelsey is great at providing some tips and techniques on how to do that. Anybody feel free to ask questions. And if you want to unmute, you can raise your hand or just go ahead and unmute. I feel like everybody's thinking, everybody's trying to digest it all.
I think too, if you have just like a comment or like an aha moment, if that would be helpful for you to share, or you think it might be helpful for the group, feel free to share like any aha moments or anything like that as well.
Hey, Kelsey and Becky. Hi.
Hi.
So my thing is, hi, thank you so much for being here. And a long time ago, I learned if you really want to convince people of something or get them on your side, using humor, and that's one of my superpowers. And so I want to make sure that by using humor and sort of real situations where it gets kind of like, oh, that was funny, but wait a minute, there's a point in there, and it's a real, I won't say struggle, a challenge. I'll say challenge to get those points across and be funny and get people to relax a little bit. I mean, yes, the oceans are dying, but we're not talking about the oceans. We're just talking about local stuff right now. And, really trying to bring the focus back and really kind of laughing at ourselves, at our ability to destroy ourselves, all at the same time, even though we say we love ourselves so much. It's like, do we? So yeah, it's just been kind of a struggle, and to not let the humor take over the message. I guess that was my whole point there. Thank you.
Yeah. I think humor is a fine line too, especially within the context of like, does what's funny always have to be like PC, and like how do you create that humor? Humor is not my superpower, so props to you. That there's such a tension that exists between like activism and comedy, that walking hand in hand with it is huge. So that's really awesome that you're able to do it, and it's difficult for sure, because it's important to not make any jokes at anyone else's expenses, still make everybody feel included, create that sticky story in a humorous way, and humor is a great way to create a sticky story, but at the same time, like, convey the message. And yeah, that's really difficult to do. So props to you for trying to bridge the gap between those two worlds.
I love that. Do you have recommendations on podcasts or books or places that people can engage more in storytelling? Because there really is an art to storytelling, I think, right? Like, how do you learn that skill in order to be able to hone in on it to share your stories?
Yeah, so when I think about the books that have been most impactful for my storytelling, I think the first two that come to mind is, and these will likely not surprise you if you've ever taken a creative writing course, but there's Bird by Bird, and then there's Stephen King's On Writing. I like Stephen King's On Writing. It's like half memoir, half tangible takeaways. Reads a little bit more like a textbook than a fun read in the second half, when he's really getting into the principles of writing. But he does a good job of layering humor into the stuff that he's writing. And he just has a lot of really great principles for making writing super accessible for people. Because Stephen King has sold hundreds of thousands of books. So hundreds of thousands of people have thought it was accessible and interesting. So he's a really great one. And then as far as podcasts go, I don't have any good storytelling podcasts. I feel like the ones that I listen to mostly have to do around copywriting. But if you did, I have this one over here. If you did want to know more, I'm in the middle of Persuasive Copywriting by Andy Maslin, and that has been a really great read as far as thinking about how to structure your writing or copywriting. Sounds like we have a lot of business owners in here. So if you're writing your own copy, that might be a good pickup for you.
Which one was the name of that one again?
It's Persuasive Copywriting by Andy Maslin.
So we can share it with everybody. And that way,
Emily
check it out.
said, not about how to make good stories, but a podcast that is just great stories, hearing lots of people tell good. Yeah, The Moth is amazing. Yeah, The Moth is really good. I also really appreciate the story, like interview structure of How I Built This, which is just getting to know different like entrepreneurs and how they ended up getting their business like off the ground and started and incredibly successful. One that I like really recommend, Sam Adams, is super fun, which you might not expect, but he's like the father of craft beer, basically. He started it. And so his is just super interesting, especially it sounds like a lot of us are in Colorado with the big craft beer culture that we have. Just super interesting to hear him talk about it. Jennifer said, this leans more towards climate change, but Catherine Hayhoe's Saving Us is a great read about human connection and effective communication. Thanks for sharing, Jennifer. I'll have to check it out. That's awesome.
I'll also add for the business owners, How I Built This is also a really empowering support. So I don't know if it's empowering, but it's, you listen to these stories and all these people that, you know, like there's Sam Adams. I loved the story of Jake Burton and Burton Snowboards, and listening to those stories, you hear that all of these business owners went through a lot of the same struggles that we as small business owners experience every day. And you start to really connect and feel that, and it really helps to build up like, oh, like I can do this. There's so much to How I Built This in general. It's just great. I agree. It's great storytelling. Guy Raz is amazing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I also love Raising Cane's, the fried chicken place.
Mm-hmm.
They are not very sustainable. I can't wait until they get rid of their styrofoam packaging. But I love the like family forward premise of like him starting his business and his if you feel like it's a great one to listen to, if you feel like you have a great idea and everyone's telling you to change it, listen to that one to reignite that fire and not changing your original principle or idea. If you really feel like you have like, if you feel like everything just keeps going wrong, the Airbnb story is a wild ride, like a wild ride. So that is one that I would recommend if you feel like nothing's going right.
I love it. Yeah, I could listen to that podcast all day, every day. It's so good. It's so good.
So good.
I've got any other questions? I've got another question, but I want to give an opportunity to everybody to ask their questions. This is a great chance to learn and, you know, learn some ways that you can help tell your story. Everyone's quiet today. I'll give you a few minutes. We'll go ahead and ask our good women in sustainability question. And I know, what makes a story sticky? There you go. Amy has a good question.
Yeah, that's a great question. Also, another good recommendation for a book. So I'm really glad you asked. Thank you, Amy. Amy, it's, I'm pretty sure it's called Stories That Stick. I think it's the book title. I can double check later too, when Becky sends everything out. But basically it goes into like the different principles of sticky stories. Mostly what makes a story sticky is someone's ability to remember it. So whether you have integrated humor or empathy, and it gives a lot of really great examples. So yeah, to answer your question, when I think about sticky stories, it's, do they have the ability to be retold again? Are they simple? Are they easy to remember? Can they be shared amongst multiple people time and time again and be able to stay? Do they have meaning, context, and purpose? You can think about like child fables too. Those are incredibly sticky stories because we pass them down for generation to generation to generation, in part because they're good story, but also because they have meaning that's ascribed to them. So yeah, I would definitely recommend checking out that book, Amy. I hope that helps. Let me know if it didn't. Rachel says, can you speak more on your mention of SEO and links? Yeah, Rachel, this could be a whole separate webinar because SEO is an incredibly interesting world that we could hop into. But when I mentioned links earlier, that was on the concept of readability and building content to create better understanding. And so when you have your website, one thing that Google likes to see if you're blogging or regularly putting out content is that everything links together, because that helps them see you're an authority in your field and you're creating information on this, which means you care about it. And it's a good thing for Google to serve as a search engine results. So whenever you're writing a blog post, try and link through to at least 2 or 3 different blog posts or places on your website. You don't necessarily want to be selling. Like at the end, you can say, book a call with me or check out these products or something like that. And that's okay. I wouldn't recommend selling in the middle of your blog post, but clicking through the other helpful information. So yeah, I hope that helps. Those internal links just basically says to Google that you're consistently creating information that could be helpful and that other people could link through to. So even Google says it's a good idea to build building blocks for people. Just saying. Carolyn, you're leaving. Oh, she's gone. Bye, Carolyn.
She left.
Yeah.
I'll ask, why is it important that we need to try to reach the masses? I mean, you kind of have all general idea, but you know, what do you think we can succeed in by trying to work towards reaching all the masses and telling our stories?
Yeah, so we need everyone. I mean, ultimately, we need oil and gas to stop being poop heads. But since this is recorded, I should probably monitor myself a little bit. But like even if you take this all aside, like the climate crisis, like our planet's warming. If we get these oil and gas to stop doing what they're doing, then we're in a much better situation, right? But also we have a planet whose population is continually growing. We have plastic that's being found in volcanoes and in our blood. Like there has to be a major culture shift that has to happen. And to do that, we can't just shame people who have been shamed for generations into change. We can't guilt trip them. We can't haze them. Like it just has to be with like open, welcome arms, because everybody who does start to care about the sustainability movement gives us a better chance of fixing these other problems that are just as terrible as climate change, in my opinion. Because at the end of the day, we have to figure out a better way to rid the world of plastic. We have to figure out a better way to manage our resources. We have to figure out a better way to move more products into a cradle to cradle life cycle. And we have to just do that with open arms to the folks who aren't here yet, in my opinion, because if we don't have that, then they will never join.
I love that. And there's a good question that Yasmin asked, is it even possible to reach the masses?
Looks like there's a second half maybe coming to that too. Maybe it would be more realistic to connect with niche audiences and encourage them to share with their networks. I kind of think of trying to talk to everyone is not effective. Yeah, definitely. Okay. So when I think about content creation, there's audience plays a huge role into it. Content creation itself could be a whole nother webinar as well. But when I think about it, you know, you're casting a net in a particular direction, right? And that direction is towards that audience. And there's a good chance that audience cares about like interior design or composting or building green homes or whatever it might be. But if we don't go into it with some of these same principles of, is it accessible to someone who's interested and your blog post is the first thing they've ever found on composting? Is it empathetic instead of shaming of people that aren't composting? Is it inclusive to them? Then that's the only way, like, we have the hope of those. Think about the first time that you were interested in something that had to do with sustainability. That moment, if someone had met you with like shaming you or really inaccessible or hard to understand or any of these things that made you feel as though you weren't a part of it and it wasn't an inclusive, open environment, then chances are you would have been like, well, screw this. These aren't my people. This isn't my place. I don't want to be a part of this. But we cast that net and create that content for the audiences that we know already want it and then are a part of it. But as we do that, we also need to consider, if someone finds this, here's the story. If this is their first chance to connect with sustainability, then I want it to be all of those things. And that's how you connect more of the masses. Now, do I think we're going to get everyone? Absolutely not. No. But at the same time, I think we have to consider, I consider the what ifs in a lot of situations, like with the whale story. Like, what if that hadn't happened? What if the story wasn't told in the way that it was told? Like, what if the dam wasn't broken? It's the same situations of, what if someone stumbles upon this? What if they've never read anything about building a greenhouse? What if they're building a house and they just make one sustainable decision because they read this blog post? What if that opens a whole nother can of decisions? And it's hard to live in a case of what if, but I personally think when it comes to our crisis, we have two options. We can live in what if, or we can live in catastrophe and panic. And so I choose to turn towards hope and the what if situations versus turning into like, we have to get people moving now. Like, it's panicked. Like, I just have to see the light in it in order to be able to create what I do. And I do think that that is an easier way to get people to move over into the sustainability world, mostly because it worked for me.
Yeah, that was beautiful. I think having that hope and I think it's sparking an idea, right? Like, I think that there's so many things that we in sustainability get. So we're so embedded in our work every day in our community of having the same conversations. We forget that a lot of people outside of our community don't necessarily talk and think the same way. And when you share facts and figures and you can spark it in their head and people know, then you can engage them in that conversation. I loved you use the word ask earlier, ask people to come into the conversation. I think that that's really valuable.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'll ask our last question. Before I do so, I love this conversation today because we recently had another webinar where we did learn a lot. It was fantastic, but it was very spoken in scientific terms. So the panelists spoke, they had an open conversation. They spoke more to each other, kind of got lost about us sitting there, and they spoke a lot of, the jargon that they knew and understood. And my 70-year-old mother was on the call because she was interested in learning about the topic. And so I called her afterwards and I said, did you understand anything? And she said, no, I was completely lost. Love her to death. She sat there for the entire presentation, but she didn't walk away with anything that she could utilize in her life because it was so scientifically spoken. So I think that that's a great example of what you're talking about today, of being able to include the masses, because we had a lot of our community members, people, in their 30s and 40s, but then my 70-year-old mother, who was excited to learn, was more lost than anything else. So that's important to think about when you're thinking, who are you speaking to and what do you want people to take away?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
So my favorite question to always ask is, what do you see, looking into your magical crystal ball, what do you see for the future of sustainability?
There's a meme that's out there right now that's like, it's 2030. Our houses are heated through geothermal heating. Nobody uses plastic. Everybody rides a bike everywhere, and there are trains to get to anywhere else you want to, or something like that. And it's just like really like whimsical and like kind of tongue in cheek. but also like, I feel like we're headed there, and it's slower than we want, but I feel like more and more people decide to care every day. And often it's for unfortunate reasons. It's, the ocean rising around their community, or it's people getting sick from ingesting things they're not supposed to, or a chemical plant coming into their community. And those aren't really the reasons, that's not everybody's reasons. And those reasons are super unfortunate. But the more and more people that are open to the propaganda of just like creating a cleaner world that like doesn't kill us. I just think people are moving in that direction, and we're going to get there, but it's going to be slower. And I think I have to have that hope, because I am a person that wants to like have kids, and I am a person that wants to like live a comfortable senior life one day, where I can just chill in a rocking chair and not stress out about an apocalypse happening around me. So I think that we're headed there, and I am continually reinvigorated by the folks doing the work in sustainability. I have always said that I wish I could have created a machine that turned plastic into compost, or I wish I could have created, something akin to solar panels that could revolutionize the world, or EVs. But I think all of you who are doing that work, you continually like give me hope. You continually make me feel like we're going to make it. And I'm just grateful to be able to support your stories in the meantime. Looks like Rachel added to what you said, Becky, and said, I was also on that call, and thank you for sharing your insight. Shannon did ask them to define the terms they were using, and I didn't realize it was not attainable to others. Dr. Elaine uses analogies to teach about soil health, most notably comparing the soil food web to baking a cake. What do you think of using analogies and stories to try and describe scientific or hard to understand topics? Great question, Rachel. Looks like you might not be on anymore. Hopefully you catch us if you're not. But yeah, I love using analogies, especially if you're trying to reach an audience that like historically you haven't been able to reach, or that is maybe not like necessarily super open to sustainability. When you're able to connect something that's important to them, like this is just good audience research from a copywriting standpoint, but when you're able to connect something that's like really important to them or relatable to them with a concept that's really abstract, you can really help accelerate their understanding through a really powerful metaphor. I love the soil microbes as a cake analogy. I am super curious what that looks like. I actually write for a client who makes this soil microbial food. So farms essentially can use less pesticides, less fertilizers, and create healthier soils and more food for the masses as our population grows. So I'm super interested in their cake analogy. That's really fun. It's always a great idea to try and figure out what's super relatable to your audience. What do they care about? And then how do you weave that in? And that's a really good way. Metaphors are a really great way to do that.
Love that. And I do want to echo Rachel. The moderator did an amazing job at clarifying that. And I think most people on the call understood it. I just thought it was interesting. Like, and I called like to hear my mom's perspective, because I knew like how she would react. And it's just, thinking about who is that audience that you're speaking to and how you engage, because she was excited to learn too.
Yasmin, you're really welcome for the simple and powerful methods. Yeah, I'm so just happy that you all are here today and that I get to support you all and talk about stories. Yeah, it's just the best.
Yeah, I love it. Any other last questions? Anybody want to unmute, or any last thoughts or comments? We will share out all this information. We'll send all the links that were shared in the chat, so you'll have those available in a follow-up email. You'll have Kelsey's information. Definitely follow her on social media so that you have an opportunity to continue to learn. She writes great blog posts, and just opportunities to sit down and have conversations that are always just so valuable. So thank you so much for your time today and sharing your expertise with us.
You're so welcome. So happy to do it. This is the most like loving, wonderful place on the internet. So I'm really, really grateful to be here.
Yeah, absolutely.
If I can help in any way, don't hesitate to reach out. Or if you want to continue the conversation, I know it's really intimidating to ask questions on a Zoom call, and I'm always happy to hop on one-on-one or, you know, talk via email. So don't hesitate to reach out if you have questions later on.
Yeah, absolutely. And yes, Emily, technical, trying to translate all of it is so challenging. I think that that's something else with sustainability, right? We talk in a lot of technical and scientific terms. So being able to translate it is so important. Thank you everybody for joining us today. womeninsustainability.org for upcoming events. Ms. Kelsey, we will also be planting trees in your name, and you'll send you a certificate later today with your tree information. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for sharing your expertise. I am so thankful to have your voice and everything that we get to learn from you in women's sustainability. So thank you.
Absolutely.
And everybody have a wonderful day. Enjoy fall. Welcome fall.
So